Yeah, as an aside, my mom's birthday we call it Veterans Day. So she was born on 11/11/18, which is very famously the first, before they called it Veterans Day, if you did not know, it was called Armistice Day. It was the day they signed the armistice to officially end World War I. And they named all the babies in the United States. The boys had the name Woodrow somewhere for the president, Woodrow Wilson, and the girls they named Victory, not Victoria, even though Victoria had been the Queen of England. So my mom's middle name is Victory, or was Victory. She would have been. It was it was 11/11 was her it wasn't 11/11/11 that 11/11/18. They signed the armistice in a train in a car, a train car, in a train that was parked. It was in Versailles, and so it was the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour is when it was signed. So it was 11/11. It was very memorable. Ruth, still thinking about you. My mom died in, of all things, 2011. Finally, says she lives to be 93. Not a bad run. It's just, it galls me. I never could beat her in Scrabble. Given my vocabulary. I told you, I was third. My sister was second. I was a piker. Oh, it's okay. Reminiscing. We are doing PowerPoint B today, hopefully in its entirety. We got to it in the other class. If I stop BSing, because I skip all the electrical stuff, thankfully. I try to get down. There's 3 animations, the third of which is excellent, that really summarize what's going on here. I sent you the review recording, obviously, for the exam next week. I sent you, basically what I sent you to take the place of the lecture, I wasn't here on Friday, was really the rest of the sort of the nerve cell anatomy. You could read it off the PowerPoint as well as I could read it to you. It's not something in it. Basically, dendrite, cell body, axons, blah, 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 axon, hillock, multiple inputs, multiple outputs, different kinds of cells. And basically in this unit, we deal in what's called the multipolar cell. It's really when you're talking about what's going on in the central, and really in the brain and the spinal cord. We get to the other ones a little more exotic in the peripheral nervous system. Nevertheless, this is our starting point. And you'll see we buzz through these slides relatively quickly until we get to the good stuff. So here it comes. So again, resting membrane potential, like any other cell, it's nothing different. And again, nerves can change extraordinarily rapidly and reset extraordinarily rapidly. By definition, they're highly excitable. And this is the electricity. We don't do this. I don't care. If you're interested in this, conductors, I always thought that was a train. You know, the man downstairs below us in the room, my colleague, Dr. Buxton, is brilliant. He teaches physics, and some of you might end up having him if you're going into certain fields. Health science, he does the physics for allied health, I would suspect, and sometimes he will do that as well. Don't do this. This is review. We're going to explore again the whole idea of the different channels. The leak channels are all about the resting membrane potential. You've seen that before. We're going to see it again briefly. The gated channels we've already talked about before, and chemically gated versus voltage gated. The voltage gated ones play a much bigger role because unlike the muscle cell, okay, when a signal occurs in a muscle cell, if an action potential occurs here, that muscle cell will fire in this direction, that direction, all over. There's no directionality to it. But you'll see because of these inactivation gates, which you saw, they really don't play a role in muscle. That gate closes and forces the signal to go what we call downstream, from where it was signaled to the end of that nerve, to release neurotransmitters and make the next nerve fire, or to come back and send a signal to your brain. That was hot, this is cold, but it was freezing this morning, whatever. So that's where we're going. So chemical, we're not going to review this. Chemical, voltage, mechanically gated, you'll get to. These are the kinds of things you get to down more in AP2 when you start talking about mechanically gated, how the eardrum works, that kind of stuff. So you saw these before when it's either closed or open. Great. Closed or open. Great. So when the gates are open, concentration gradient plays the same role, more electrochemical stuff. The resting membrane potential, roughly about 70 millivolts. We saw this before. There's a variation, and by definition, what it means to be polarized, to review it again, more positive on the outside, along the membrane, inside the cell, neutral. In the extracellular fluid or the interstitial fluid or the plasma, neutral. But right along that membrane, polarized. And reinforces this is something we looked at before. What is the chemical or ionic and the charged particle concentration in the intracellular and the extracellular fluid, and the permeability? That's all about those leak channels. And again, there's a vast abundance of potassium leak channels. Is really what's that. We looked at this when we talked about the cell way back for the first exam. So this is where we're putting it back into the picture, so to speak. And you'll see the animation where they'll do the same thing. And really, think of this as the axon. So here it's being effectively, we're looking in this area is really where we're going to be able to focus on where this charge changes and changes rapidly. So what are the differences? The extracellular fluid we know has more sodium. The intracellular fluid has more potassium, proportionally speaking. What makes it, other than right along the membrane, what makes it neutral is the abundance of chloride. This is a little introductory unit you're going to hear down the road, not today when we get to neurotransmitters, starts on Wednesday, things about chloride-gated channels. Chloride is negative. When that gets in the cell, it makes it harder to fire. That's the time when we'll start to talk about, when we hear about somebody on sleeping pills or sedatives. That's how they work. That's how alcohol works. We're getting there. The intracellular fluid has potassium, and why that is so fixed is proteins. Where chloride conceivably could enter the cell, and does, proteins can't leave it. They're just too darn big. If proteins are leaking out of an axon, that axon's shot. That nerve cell's dead. It's a mess. So potassium plays the most important role. We already knew that from before. That potassium levels, and you're going to hear that point reiterated a lot in AP2. And as I said, to any of you going into a clinical field, particularly nursing, potassium levels are, when they start to fluctuate, people start to get very, very nervous. So here's the first animation, relatively brief. Should be able to hear it.
The human brain alone contains about 100 billion nerve cells called neurons. A neuron, like all cells, has negatively and positively charged ions in the fluids located both inside and outside of the cell. However, the ionic composition of these two fluids is markedly different. The inner surface of the membrane is negatively charged, while the outer surface is positively charged. This unequal distribution of charge creates a voltage across the plasma membrane, known as the membrane potential. In a resting, unstimulated neuron, this membrane potential is known specifically as the resting membrane potential. The value of the resting membrane potential depends on two factors. The first is the presence of concentration gradients across the plasma membrane, especially those gradients for sodium and potassium ions. The second is the permeability of the plasma membrane to sodium and potassium. In the resting state, this permeability depends on the number of non-gated leak channels present in the membrane for these ions. The magnitude of the resting membrane potential, inside relative to outside, is measured in millivolts using a voltmeter and two electrodes. We'll now place both electrodes in the extracellular fluid. Note that the voltmeter records 0 voltage. This is because the unequal distribution of charge exists only across the plasma membrane. The intra and extracellular fluids are otherwise electrically neutral. However, when we insert one of the electrodes into the intracellular fluid, a voltage is recorded. The value of the resting membrane potential varies, but on average it is minus 70 millivolts.
Okay, and that's really, so it's just giving you, so it's really reiterating stuff, but maybe showing you more about the negative, because proteins, when they are in solution, remember they're made of amino acids. An acid in water loses its proton. but what's left, and the proton is positive, so what's left is negative charge. That's not relevant here. If you're taking micro, it's kind of how certain stains work. We talk about acidic and basic staining. That's for micro. That's the lab part of micro. So voila, this is, and now that all you're going to see this illustration again, these are the pumps. Okay, the different sodium potassium concentrations and permeability. To me, this slide's a little out of sequence, whoever they put it in here. The whole idea, and this translates importantly into what for the test coming up on Monday, a week from today, is the sodium potassium pumps are always busy, even in a resting cell, because sodium will always be leaking in and potassium will be leaking out, and those pumps are busy. When the cell fires, like a nerve cell, they're extraordinarily busy. They're very, very active, and there's just tons of them. But what they're doing, remember, you have the distinction is very straightforward. So effectively, you're always bringing in three. Typically, what happens because you have potassium out and sodium coming in, the pumps work in this way. They pump, and it's typically that 3-to-2 relationship. 3 potassiums going out, a bigger part. 3 sodiums going out, 2 potassiums coming in. And remember, that's when you get that neuromuscular junction, it flip flops. 3 sodiums are coming in, and potassiums are going out. So this is just cleaning it up, so to speak. The proteins, big player, slightly permeable to sodium, 25 times more permeable to potassium. So potassium is really the important product. And down the road, again, you're going to see when we start talking about chloride channels, and we'll probably get to that a fair amount Wednesday, maybe not in its entirety. We'll certainly have the remaining portions of this chapter done no later than Friday. Probably introduce the next chapter. Differences in plasma membrane permeability. More potassium diffuses out than sodium diffuses in. So yeah, the pumps got to get busy. Again, to maintain that concentration gradient, they're constantly working to offset that degree of leakage that's going on. So even if it's at rest, and nerves don't rest a whole lot, you're constantly using it. And this just gives you what I think is a poor graphic because I can't read it. And I don't suspect it's very easy for you to read unless you blow it up enough to be able to read that stuff. But again, we've seen something like that. Similarly, here are the pumps. Here are the potassiums exiting. You got more potassiums exiting than sodium entering. And here's the pump to offset it. It changes. And now the nomenclature is a little confusing. Remember, the neuromuscular junction is all about one thing. The nerve firing the muscle. When the acetylcholine is released, it has one message: fire. If there's a sufficient amount released over a sufficient period of time, it will lead to the action potential and the muscle will contract. Okay? So we have end plate potentials, not enough instructions to fire, versus an action potential. We're going to generate at a minimum a twitch and likely the muscle to fire. We use a different terminology in nerves. They're called graded potentials. Similar, like an end plate potential, it only works over a short distance, and it doesn't mean that it's going to generate an action potential. Effectively, the nerves have a very simple language. Okay, it's a little more complicated. The neuromuscular junction has one signal from acetylcholine, fire. And if I say that enough, fire, finally the muscle's going to get the message and fire. Nerves are different. They have conversation, 2 types: fire, don't fire, don't fire. That's it. Of course, not all nerves in the central nervous system release something that's going to say fire. They release different chemicals, neurotransmitters, in different areas that will either say fire or don't fire. And we sum them up. It's like the nerves are having a conversation. I think you should fire. I don't feel like fire. Come on, fire. My buddy, no, I got another guy over here who told me don't fire. Basically, that's what's going on. So the potentials, we call those graded potentials. And if they are sufficient to reach threshold, it will generate the action potential, which inevitably will result in that axon triggering all the way to its terminus and releasing neurotransmitters, telling the next nerve to do something. Again, whether it tells it to fire or don't fire, that's a whole other lecture. So it's a very, very complicated system, and I think you're probably getting it from my struggles trying to really bring that point home. So changes in the membrane potential are used as signals to receive, integrate, and send information. That's what they do. We use the terms because there's different messages. We use different terminology. Again, end plate potentials are only telling it to fire. We don't have to qualify it. Here, some of the signals are going to make it more likely to fire. They're called depolarizing signals. So they make the inside of the membrane less negative, more positive, either way, and increases the likelihood. The other makes it less likely. That's a little bit of ahead of the game for those chloride channels. Chlorides are negative. When you bring them in, they make the nerve less likely to fire. Okay? We call them inhibitory. If it's dipolar, more likely to fire, we call it excitatory. And if it's less likely to fire and leads to remember, it's already polarized. If you hyperpolarize it, you make it more and more negative on the inside. And you're going to see that graphically in a little bit. The inside of the membrane becomes more negative than the resting membrane potential, so it's less likely to fire. Again, that's really what your brain's doing right now. You're listening to me, and is it important? Should I write this down? Should I circle it? Should I make a note to myself? Or is he just off on one of his stupid tangents and I can catch him now? It's okay. I've been in your seat. I was sitting in a seat getting lectures from somebody when I was 50 years old. Trying to become a high school teacher. Thank goodness, I would have lasted the over and under on being a high school teacher 10 seconds until I told somebody off or said a swear word where I shouldn't say it. Right? 10 seconds, 15. Moving on. So depolarization this way, repolarization that way, but hyperpolarization makes it go less. Depolarization closer to the threshold, hyperpolarization farther away. So here, let's say threshold is here at minus 50 arbitrarily. So you're a little bit closer. Here, you've moved this down to like 73 or 74. You're farther away. Those graded potentials don't go very far. Okay? The channel, it opens some additional voltage channels to increase it, but not enough. And eventually it's limited. Okay, it does open some of those sodium and potassium gated channels, but not enough. Okay, and so sometimes it'll depolarize, or sometimes it'll hyperpolarize. They get into it by naming certain of these, and you don't have to know any of these about for the time being, a postsynaptic or receptor potentials. To me, I don't think that's really terminology we need to, complicate matters more than it already is. But it's a very good way of looking at it here. Again, this is typical resting. Positive on the outside, negative on the inside. It doesn't matter where. Top of the membrane, bottom of the membrane, around the membrane. When you have a stimulus here, what it does is this. That one area flips negative to positive. From positive to negative, negative to positive. Because of that, depending how strong it is, it will induce some of the others in the area to also change. So it's kind of like that rippling effect. Is the rippling effect enough to get a substantial number of these voltage gated channels? And if it does, then we're in business. Okay. Once the gated ion channel opens, the polarization spreads from one area to another. And they're showing it to you here, but it's limited. It's only going to change this isolated area. That effectively is a depolarizing signal. Not enough for an action potential. Adjacent areas spreading it, but it dissipates quickly. It goes away. And so it only is a short distance signal. To generate the action potential, it has to get to these large clusters of voltage-gated sodium and then potassium channels. And then, again, and you're going to see the role of what are called inactivation gates. I mentioned them in passing in muscle. There's nothing about them on the muscle test. But this really plays a pivotal role in starting to understand a concept called the absolute refractory period, and also something called the relative refractory period. That's going to come your way much more in depth when you get to cardiovascular. So here it is. Starts here, pretty good size signal, but it dissipates, decays, whatever word you want to use. Okay, the voltage declines. It's decremental rather than incremental. I'm not going to ask you that. So, action potentials, how it sends a long distance signal. Muscle cells, last unit, nerve cells, and the axon, this unit. Brief reversal, by definition. They don't decay. They're not decremental. Once they fire, it propagates and it all is the identical signal until it ends by causing neurotransmitters to be released from the end of that nerve or an electrical signal. And we call it an impulse. Fancy name, same thing. Opening of these very specific, very powerful voltage gated channels. And just like in the muscle, when you got into the muscle and saw the whole muscle fire, first sodium, then potassium. You'll see this shortly. This is, look at both of these, the key players, sodium channels. Here, you can see that's closure. And this is the activation gate. Okay, in this case, it's in sort of a neutral position. Effectively, it's not blocking stuff from going through. When that signal reaches this cluster in that direction, okay, it will allow, this will open first. Vast amounts of sodium will come in. When it is done, when the sodium has come in, at that point, this inactivation gate will effectively close and render this unable to be retriggered for a short period of time. In nerves, we're talking about a millisecond, maybe 2, maybe 4. It depends on how fast that nerve, extraordinarily rapid. Okay, turnover. And then the potassium channels either open or close. This key player about the directionality and about the absolute refractory period is that inactivation gate. I would remember that. So resting state, all gated sodium potassium channels are closed. Only those leakage channels are open, and that's all about the resting membrane potential. Sure, yeah, I understand sodium potassium pumps are working to make sure that we're able to maintain that gradient, but they go bonkers when that nerve fires. Each sodium channel has 2 voltage sensitive gates, closed at rest, opens with depolarization, and the inactivation gate, which is open at rest, blocks the channel once it is open to prevent more sodium from entering the cell. Each potassium channel closed or open. That's what I was saying before. And they'll show it to you. Here's neutral. This is a rest. You're whatever. You're not using that particular circuit in your brain. Again, what we showed you before. Closed. Okay, closed here. Nothing happening. Depolarization, when it occurs sufficiently, is going to cause those voltage-gated channels to open. Sodium's going to rush in. The sodium activation and activation gates are wide open. The influx causes vast amounts of depolarization. And as a result, and assuming we reach threshold for this case, then it becomes a positive feedback loop, meaning it's self-perpetuating. It's such a dramatic change, it's going to induce the next area and the next area and the next area to change. It's going to open up all of those channels, and you're going to get that spike that we call the upward spike, or the depolarization spike of the action potential. It's going to jump by 100 millivolts. Typically threshold 55 to 50 from a resting of 70. There's that giant spike. Next step. Sodium channels inactivate. Notice it doesn't say close. That's the swinging of that gate. Close it. The door's open, but nothing can get through. I've got a screen. Whatever analogy works in your mind. Can't get through. Inactivation gates close. Membrane permeability of sodium declines to the resting state, and that's what causes that action potential from stopping at a certain point, relative to that 100 millivolt change. The potassium channels open, voltage gated again, it's that big change about voltage, exits down its gradient and repolarizes. Now, really, after while this is going on, now you're getting massive activity of the sodium potassium pumps. Again, electrical events are going to precede chemical events. The electrical event is going to go very rapidly. The chemical events are an effort to restore that balance. I got so many sodiums, I got to push them all out. I got so many potassiums out, I got to bring them back in, and it's going to expend a lot of energy. Nervous system uses a lot of energy. So here you can see it. Now this is blocked off. This is open. It's going to decline rapidly. Interestingly, it's going to do this. The potassium channels remain open even as the sodium channels reset. So there's even an excessive potassium efflux. A lot more potassium going out than we might have suspected normally. So the inside of the membrane becomes hyperpolarized. Basically, it comes below, as you will see on the illustration. So maybe its resting was minus 70, now it's minus 75. And that's part of something that you will come to know is called a relative refractory period, meaning it's harder to stimulate. Absolute means you can't stimulate it again. Relative means it's harder. It takes more because you've got a longer way to go. Rather than minus 70 to minus 55, now it's minus 75 to minus 55. More juice to open it up. There's the overshoot, hyperpolarization. And they'll comment on these in the next animation without me going over those again. We're going over this again. Ugh.
Neurons communicate over long distances by generating called action potentials. Most action potentials originate in the axon's initial segment, a region also called the trigger zone. During an action potential, voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels open and close, thus altering the membrane's permeability to sodium and potassium ions. As these ions diffuse through the channels, the membrane potential changes. It depolarizes from the resting state of minus 70 millivolts to a peak value of plus 30 millivolts, and then quickly repolarizes back to minus 70 millivolts after a brief period of hyperpolarization.
All in 4
In this
milliseconds.
topic, we explore, step by step, the events that occur as an action potential is generated in the axon's initial segment.
And so it's just trying to graphically show you what occurs. And you saw earlier with these guys moving in sort of in and out.
Voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels open and close.
So you can see that
very,
very rapidly.
Sodium and potassium
A
ions.
fraction of a second quicker than they could demonstrate here, obviously. Repolarization is a reset the electrical but not the ionic or chemical conditions. Those terms are interchangeable. And so after repolarization, the sodium potassium pumps thousands in an axon, thousands restored. And they all require energy. So even, I mean, how many times I'm brain dead. I've been studying all night. I am so tired. You're utilizing it proportionally, even when you're not physically active. The combination of both of those, I mean, really will get you quite tired, comparatively speaking. So there's different things affect us differently in that regard. So it's interesting to see, and everybody's. I mean, this is me just speaking off the cuff. I always feel everybody's levels are different. They have, like my one son has very little tolerance for this kind of academic stuff, but he has a lot of physical activity. I mean, he's doing a new job. He's doing training. It's all computer based. I go, how have you been doing? He's just killing me. My brain hurts because he has to do all these reading and cast tests, competency tests, for him to be able to proceed with the job he does, which is basically a more physical type of a job. Very interesting. He's also not the world's best student. Did I tell you that? My younger son and my daughter only went to college for parties. There's the pumps again. Not all depolarization events are action potentials. It must reach threshold. The membrane, 15 to 20 millivolts on average. There's variations, of course. Sodium first, and then sodium influx exceeds potassium efflux, and the positive. So you open enough so it reaches that. Basically, those little signals say fire or don't fire. The depolarizing or excitatory signals overwhelm the inhibitory signals and it fires. And that's what it meant. Once it occurs, it's all or none. Completely or not at all. So what's unique about this and different from muscle, again, effectively, muscle is still mostly about frequency, but not all. Nerves, it's all about frequency. Every action potential is identical. With nerves, as we increased the oomph, as we increased the power arbitrarily, the amount of voltage, we reached a max point. We started off, that was that whole idea. If we didn't reach threshold, we didn't get any movement. But once we activated all the motor units in a given muscle, it's going to contract. We could increase the power more. We can't make it do more. We can't make it contract more than it physiologically limits. The nervous system is like that. And you're going to see here is the perfect example of frequency equals amplitude. When I want to make a point and I speak very loudly, it's like when I want that, what you're hearing is the signal is coming at you very fast. I'm speaking slowly with anything. This morning, very cold out, okay? The cold sensors were going, what the heck happened? We finally had a hard frost, that type of stuff, Anything, pick an analogy that works for you. Pain is like that, hot and cold is like that, anything. Loud sounds are like that versus soft sounds. Any of those kinds of things. So propagation is the action potential being transmitted from wherever the signal was. Typically, it starts at the hillock. What happens is a tip of one nerve tells another nerve to fire, and it's basically what happens. There's a sufficient amount of instructions to fire that signal will basically carry itself to that area where really the hillock is where the axon starts. And that what they call on this animation the trigger zone. Doesn't matter. But you could stimulate the nerve anywhere along the nerve. It's there. When we do that electromyographic testing, we're trying to assess how rapidly nerves conduct impulses. We'll have a sensor here that will induce the nerve to fire. We'll have another one farther down the nerve. We know the distance. We can measure it. And then you can see how fast the signal get from point A to point B. And we can calculate that with the aid of a computer and know the velocity of that particular nerve. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that are based on this, how it propagates in those regards. So leads to depolarization in that area, which in turn causes the next and the next, and that's what propagation is. Self-propagating, once it's an action potential, faster in myelinated, the thicker the nerve and the more myelin, and you're going to see that shortly, the faster that signal goes. Okay? Since sodium channels closer to the action potential are still inactivated, no new action potential is generated there. That's the channels closer from where it started, they have that inactivation gate. That's where it only goes. You're going to see, and I wrote it here, and you'll see the same terminology again. In myelinated nerves, we call it saltatory or jumping conduction. You're going to see it appears to jump is a better way to express it, between those nodes or sheath gaps, and they'll show that to you fairly elegantly. So here, you can see what goes on. It's very, very quickly changes, but it's sufficient. That big jump is an action potential. So it's rapid. Boom, nothing here, it's local. Now, finally gets to there. And notice the signal is keep going what we call downstream. This will show you. It's loud, I got you.
Action potentials propagate in a continuous fashion in unmyelinated axons. Once an action potential is generated in the initial segment of the axon, it propagates the entire length of the axon. Recall that a threshold stimulus causes voltage-gated sodium channels to open. The influx of sodium ions generates an action potential. It also establishes a depolarizing current that flows to the next segment and brings it to threshold. Voltage-gated sodium channels open, regenerating the action potential in this segment of the axon. Current flows from this segment and depolarizes the next segment to threshold, thus regenerating the action potential yet again. In this way, regeneration continues in one direction all the way down to the axon terminals. The basis for unidirectional propagation is revealed when we take a closer look. By the end of the depolarization phase of the action potential, all voltage-gated sodium channels inactivate and voltage-gated potassium channels open. These two events render this segment of the axon temporarily insensitive or refractory to another depolarizing stimulus. However, voltage-gated sodium channels in the downstream segment are closed and receptive to a depolarizing stimulus. Thus, propagation occurs sequentially down the axon to the axon terminals. In myelinated axons, action potential propagation is a bit different. Here they propagate in a saltatory or leaping fashion. The myelin sheath consists of multiple layers of tightly wrapped glial
Very
cell
good
membranes,
illustration of how thick it is.
but this sheath is not a continuous one. Exposed areas of axonal membrane, known as nodes of Ranvier, occur at discrete intervals. Voltage-gated sodium channels are abundant in the nodes, but largely absent between nodes. So, action potentials are regenerated at each node, not in areas covered by the myelin sheath. However, the myelin sheath does provide the insulation necessary for the rapid spread of depolarizing current. And the sooner the nodes reach threshold, the faster action potentials propagate along the axon. Saltatory conduction is extremely fast. Velocities often exceed 100 meters per second. In contrast, continuous conduction is fairly slow. Velocities rarely exceed 2 meters per second. Nevertheless, both continuous and saltatory conduction propagate action potentials over varying distances because action potentials regenerate along the way.
So in that way they work.
Summary: propagation of an action potential. Once generated, the action potential propagates the entire length of the axon without decrement.
And so that's the idea of why. Now, the interesting part about this, if you go back and take a look, when they're talking about this between the sheath gaps, that's where you have an abundance of these, particularly the sodium channels. Years ago, I mean, when everybody first started to learn about this, it was like they thought the signal was jumping. It's not a big deal for you. I'm just trying to give you some context. We know more about it now. It was like the signal would jump exterior to the nerve. That's not really the case. All that myelin is such a good insulator. That's why the more myelin, the better it is. The signal travels rapidly along the interior between those gaps or nodes, from the area where there's a lot of those sensors to the next area where there's a lot of those sensors. That accounts for this 50 and even as much as 100 times faster amount of conduction. The distinction is, I mean, I can call up, you can call up anybody in the West Coast, again, talk to them in real time. But if you want to get there, it's going to take you a whole lot longer, even on an airplane, flying at, 500 miles an hour. It's going to still take you from here, 4 hours to get to California? You can be talking to somebody, you can be texting with somebody there in real time. That's the distinction, really, when you start to think about differences that occur. And that's really where the neurotransmitters come in as well. It gives you an idea about how vast the difference is. You can do the math. And I'm sure you can just go online and say, convert meters per second to miles per hour, and boom, you can be pretty amazed at how rapidly it is. So all action potentials are alike. That's frequency. Frequency is the number of impulses received per second. Higher frequency, stronger stimulus. Frequency equals amplitude. So it doesn't matter whether I have a little stimulus or a big stimulus, the action potential is the same. That big stimulus is interpreted as frequency. So that was, I heard something, this is, boom. That was a real crack of thunder or whatever, pick an analogy. So the refractory period, again, the nerve cannot possibly re-trigger. The voltage gauge sodium channels are open, and the neuron cannot respond to another stimulus. And in the meantime, those inactivation gates are present. You should have put that in. So the absolute refractory period, time from the opening until resetting, action potential is an all or none event, and it's only one-way transmission. And really the big player of that is certainly those inactivation gates. It's the only voltage gated channels they have. And they didn't make a big deal of it in muscle because it really, the nature of the way we use muscles, the refractory period doesn't come into play. Again, when you get to cardiac muscle and understand how the heart works, it has a very extended, your absolute refractory period isn't milliseconds, it's a quarter of a second. I mean, the heart just fires, it has to rest. That's the only way it can work for your lifetime as rapidly as it does. So the relative refractory period comes afterwards. The most sodium channels, that's the watchword, is most, return to their resting state. Some potassium channels are still opening. Repolarization is occurring. But typically, particularly as you get during that period of time, it's not completely returned. In order to re-trigger it, and particularly when it goes below threshold, okay, and that sort of hyperpolarization, it's going to take a stronger stimulus to generate the difference. You're going to have to overcome those factors. I don't. This doesn't make any sense to me, so I'm not going to talk about it. My dog is not that bright. We'll do certain things for food. Absolute refractory period. So you can see it. We're talking about, but it's very significant. Okay, and you're going to see more. So here we're talking about a millisecond, not 250 milliseconds when you get to the heart. So it's a big difference, but it sort of lays the framework, or it should, trying to give you an idea of the basis of what we call absolute and relative refractory periods. They're coming your way, I suspect. And here you can see it's just harder. It starts to get down and reaches a certain point roughly here where now I could re-trigger it, but it's considerably harder to do so because this is really flowing out very, very rapidly and will inevitably overshoot a little bit. And so, okay, I can reach 3 milliseconds or 4 milliseconds is very quick comparatively. Action potentials occur only in axons, not in the other cell area. Again, the signals coming in, fire or don't fire, eventually that whole process leads it to that trigger zone or hillock, and that's where effectively the action potential occurs. That's where that cluster of voltage gated channels are located. And so large diameter fibers have less resistance, so they flow faster, and the more myelin, the better. And that's the distinction between continuous and saltatory conduction. In myelinated axons, 30 times on average, the sheets insulated, prevent the charge from leaking. That's why it's through, not in the outside, but in the old days, it was easier to kind of demonstrate that. Like on a blackboard we used to do. We didn't have the graphics available to us that we have today. The abundance of the sodium channels in the sheath gaps or nodes, the action potentials are only at those gaps, so it appears is a very good word to jump. It doesn't jump, it looks like it's jumping. And they're just showing you this, and I don't get a lot out of there. The sheath gaps. This is, we mentioned MS in passing. Again, autoimmune diseases, 15 to 55, 3 to 4 times more likely to occur in women than in men. Be very wary about that. I've commented to the other class, I don't like it when people are dismissive of complaints. Young women come into a doctor's office. This is very traditional. And it's changed lives that we have more women in medicine today and more nurse practitioners and things like that. Oh, I got these terrible, I have my ex-wife. Headaches, I don't feel good. Oh, stress, tension, migraines. Oh, premenstrual syndrome. It's very dismissive. Rather than, and you can't dismiss somebody's complaints, even if your BS index is very high. Okay? You've got to go past that, and unless you know they're a well-known drug seeker or something like that, you got to be very, very watchful about that. So myelination, sclerosis means hardening, mostly in the central nervous system. Demyelinated axons increase sodium channels, causing cycles of relapse and remission. So it's irregular how it is. It's very unpredictable disease. I've seen patients with minimal symptoms, and I've seen ones who are really, they're going to die from it sooner than later. All of these things are part of it. Immunological activity, please keep your vitamin D levels up. Mild, a little bit of vitamin D supplement extra, very good for breast cancer, very good preventative breast cancer, prostate cancer, osteoporosis, da-da. And we don't do the group A, the large fibers, group B or group C. And so if you wondered how local anesthetic works, here it is. They block voltage-gated sodium channels. That's how they work. If you want to know more about local anesthetics, just ask your dentist. They're the pros when it comes to all of that because they use it constantly. I use it a lot too. Okay, and there are different things. Cold can interrupt it, pressure, like your arm falling asleep, etc. And we're done. Very good. See everybody Wednesday. Oops, going the wrong way, Lou.